Right here at the corner of Houston Lake Road and Lake Joy Road is Lamar Cemetery. This is a very small cemetery at the corner of Houston Lake and Fagan Mill Road here in Warner Robins. As a kid, I remember driving out this way. This was the country just a couple decades ago, and seeing this cemetery. And with the explosive growth in this part of town, this is no doubt a historical location that has been surrounded by houses and other construction. From a historical perspective, this cemetery has really a real mixture of very old graves and relatively new burials. There isn't really a lot of money, I guess, in this cemetery because a lot of the markers are very plain, hard to read, and appear to be very basic. As we can see here, this gentleman was buried in 1960, and it is unfortunately hard to read the marker. But just up the way, we have a marker for a Towton, malaria Towton, who was born in 1904, died in 1921. So this individual was only 17 years, and you can see by the marker that this is a very historic grave. There's no markings on the slab. The shape of the headstone does tend to lean towards a very historical nature. Now, just to the right is a military marker for George Towton in the U.S. Army, who died in 1998. So as you can see, you have a 1998 deceased individual right next to someone who died in 1921. 1987, yet another marker who does not have any writing on it or has worn down. So these are not really family plots. It's more or less individual locations that people were buried at. There are a couple other military veterans that are represented in this cemetery. Perry Hughley, an Army veteran who served in both World War II, Korea, and Vietnam as well, passed away in 1990 at the age of 86. Lucius Fan, who is buried right next to him, World War II veteran. But as you can see, there's some other graves right around that just appears to not be related, but just individuals who were placed here in this cemetery. Walking through here, these are very basic graves. You've got the slab with a headstone that just appears to have the name and the birth and birth and death dates on them. I'm not really sure what the purpose of this is, if this is something where the individual died and did not have the means for a more intricate grave, or something that they worked out with the cemetery, sort of a package deal, not to be insensitive, but there's really not a lot of flair to these graves. Now, a lot of people probably prefer that, just a basic place to put their loved ones. But this one, like I said, it just appears to be concrete with their names etched on the headstones. Unfortunately, this individual died in 1986, and you can tell that their grave has already disintegrated. The headstone has cracked. It's basically just concrete. This is pretty unfortunate for this individual. Sort of a contrast to the rest of the cemetery. You have a grave here, and a Louise Hauser right here. These are more recent burials, 2014 and 2016, that do seem to have a more decorative headstone. And in the back here, we've got two other individuals, both died almost within a month of each other in 2020, that have their pictures on their grave markers. So I'm not really sure what the situation is here, but there's decorations, there's angels, there's their photos, and some very beautiful flowers on their graves. I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself with this, but as you see in this area, we've got just grave after grave, a lot of which you can't read the inscriptions anymore. You have a few more of these basic headstones. There's a Rosa and Jerome Braswell that have just the basic concrete headstone with their names, birth and death dates. etched on them, Lizzie and Henry Bagley. Here's another veteran. And then right here next, you have just basically a piece of concrete and some etchings here. A birth and death date here, 1874 to 1950. Right back here, you have some more of these basic headstones, a couple of slabs, and just what appears to be years of weathering. Right over here, you do have another slab that seems to be sunken in the ground. And it's not that I feel like there's no care in the cemetery, but it does seem that this type of cemetery just was not intended for individuals with a lot of means. Families who probably can't uptake the cemetery, not really sure if the city has control of this, or it's privately held, or if this is just something that funeral homes have access to. I don't really want to call it a pauper cemetery, but this is not really set up like a lot of the cemeteries that we visited here in the past. One thing that's happened here is there's a lot of trees, or were a lot of trees. There's a lot of recent storm damage here that's brought down some limbs, and I feel like I'm showing a lot of the same scenery here, but you can tell that there's been some environmental impacts here as well. When you see this type of thing in a cemetery, it did always puzzle me and seem pretty unique. You've got this particular grave that's not lined up like the rest of them are. It was laid sort of at an angle, or you wonder if maybe it was set up one way and just over the years the slab has moved. Not really sure that's possible, but it's just sort of unique to see. You can't really see the death date of this individual, but they were born in 1924, so it's not really old. But then there's nobody buried in this area, and then way over on the side is another grave that is also not really set up in the same line as the ones in the other parts of the cemetery. So I always wondered in this case if the individuals who were the caretakers of the cemetery sort of had a different idea of how to line these up, and the rest of the cemetery just didn't really fall into place. As I've noted, there's graves that are sort of all over the place here in this cemetery. This is another military veteran here, Timothy Marshall, who's in the U.S. Air Force, and there's their military designed headstone. Then at the foot of the grave is your basic headstone that we've seen in some of the other graves, which I believe is just standard funeral home issue in this case. But you can see that unfortunately it's cracked. I showed some of these other graves in those panoramic views I was doing, and I'm just going to walk not down these lines. You can see that these are lined up in rows, and these are, like I said, just your basic concrete slab with a small headstone. And actually, from what I can tell, it doesn't really appear that these headstones are attached to the slab. The concrete is just here. There's their names, birth and death dates. It's just basically placed here at the top of the grave, which, curious to me, is the longevity of something like this. Unfortunate for the families that over time the grave of their loved one might be harder and harder to see or visit or even know that they're there. Or cemetery enthusiasts like us that are coming, don't really get to see who these individuals are. But not everybody can afford a burial with a lot of flair to it. But, at least there is a final resting place for these individuals that passed away. This feature here, I don't really call it a feature, but there's always been trees, always been growth, always been, well, I don't really call them trees, but there's really not been a lot of landscape done. I know that there's some grass mowing, but just always curious to me why no one's ever come and cleaned up around this area, especially with these large, I don't even really know what you call them, branches, weeds growing up through here. And there is another location, this tree here. It's not a really old tree, but it has grown up here, and there is a grave right underneath it, a headstone that's leaning right up against the tree. So, and the more and more I think about it, these graves over here, this person born in 1899, died in 1948, their families are probably long gone, or at least they may not be in this area anymore, or enough generations have passed that there's not really anybody to come that's it. But it would be fortunate if there were some more grave enthusiasts. I need to use that word enthusiast, but historical societies that would come and take some interest in cemeteries like this, clean them up, and at least try to mark, log, do something to keep a record of who's buried here. It's hard to read the name here, but this again is just a slab of concrete that at one point when it was wet, someone took basically just a stick and etched their name in it. I could do a rubbing, as some people do, but you really can't. I can see Willie, but I can't really see the dates. But from what I can tell, this doesn't even seem to be one that's that old. But I guess you have to be buried or placed somewhere. But I guess they, like I said, did not have the means to have a more intricate grave here. This right here is just rows, 2 rows individual of just slabs. There is some more writing at the top that looks like I said, when it was wet cement, that someone basically just took a stick and wrote the name in them. And I'd really like to go back and research this to see if this is a, when someone died, didn't have any family, no one to claim the body, if this is just where they put them. I haven't seen a lot of cemeteries, but I haven't really gone to areas that have this section. I really need to do my research. Instead of talking negatively about this, I really just need to find out what's happened here. But due to the environmental landscape, you can see that a couple of these slabs have sort of sunk into the ground, would have to be dug out to really make a record of who these individuals are. There's some really, really old flowers here, and the care just really doesn't happen here. And again, don't mean to be critical. I'm more or less just pointing out what's different from a lot of the places that we've visited. This is the bottom edge of the cemetery. You can see my son down there having fun. But there's real kind of no rhyme or reason here. I guess they just take up space wherever they can, just sort of put them where they can to make room for everybody that's to be put here. And at some point, I might make a follow-up at some point. I want to contact one of the local African-American cemeteries that I know has put people here to really kind of just ask what the situation here. Here's a couple more veterans. And Augustus Hodges, who was born in 1918, died in 1991. This is Curtis Tharp, died in 1986, a World War II veteran. But then you've got Minnie Eberhardt, who died in 99. You can kind of see for someone who's only been deceased for a little over 20 years, and there's a lot of wear in her headstone. And then Miss Beulah Brooks and Charity Clayton. And there's just some more, unfortunately, cracked headstones. But then, and I'm going all over the place, but there's just so much variety here. I really hate to say variety, but you've got this type of slab, which we've seen in other cemeteries, and you've got this solid white one, and then you have these 2 solid white ones that's got actually a head marker here. This is different than anything we see in the cemetery. That is something that's very popular in the other cemeteries we've been to. This individual passed away in 2021. That is less than a year ago. And this is where they were placed, but there's no flowers here. There's really nothing that makes this stand out. So again, I'm going to do my research and sort of find out if this is where the family may not be able to afford a funeral and a burial, that the cemetery, or excuse me, the funeral home just places them here. A couple more things I want to point out about this cemetery, and I also just realized that my finger has been in a couple of these shots, but it's been a while since I've tried to make any videos like this. Annie Brown, I don't know Annie Brown, but you can see she died in August of just this last year. And an interesting thing about this is I remember we lived just about a mile down the road. When you drive by here, you can see when they're having the graveside service. I came by on my lunch break, and I drove by and they were having the graveside service, and came by later in the day, and this slab and this headstone were already here. And I've been to plenty of other cemeteries to see that usually, they bury the casket, they close the grave, but it's usually a while before you see anything on the grave. But it was just unique, like they already had it on the truck, already had it set up, and it was just placed here. which also makes me wonder how secure it is. But that was something that I had never seen before. Like I said, a slab and a grave marker that was placed the very same day. This is also something I've never seen before. This is basically two slabs laid on top of each other, which, as we've seen all over the cemetery, you've got what appears to be the basic concrete slab, and perhaps the family came back at some point and paid for a more decorative slab. This James Jones passed away in 2012, and maybe they got the standard issue funeral home slab, and the family was able to come back and replace it. The last thing I'm going to say, sort of wrap up our video here at Lamar Cemetery, is I pointed these out earlier. These are two individuals that passed away at the end of 2020 that both have their pictures on their grave markers. But as I live about a mile down the road, whenever there's a funeral here or something going on, I mean, obviously we would see it, but these graves just sort of popped up out of nowhere. So just interesting to see that maybe they had a service, maybe they didn't have a service, and the funeral home or the caretakers out here just had a burial without anybody else here. So finishing up here at Lamar Cemetery, I know we've had a variety of videos, a variety of different cemeteries, and again, I don't mean to be critical or disrespectful of this cemetery. It's just different. I know there's probably plenty of other cemeteries like this. It's just the first one that I've really taken a closer look at, and it's unique because it's literally about a mile from our house. So finishing up here at Lamar Cemetery in Warner Robins, Georgia. And if anybody really knows more about this cemetery and wants to comment, just let us know. We're just amateurs that are walking through a local cemetery. And in fact, I'm just talking as I move the camera around. So as I'm saying something and the video goes out of focus, please forgive us, but we're just some local cemetery enthusiasts. So hope you enjoyed the video. I plan to make more sort of as we come across more interesting cemeteries here in the Middle Georgia area.